Okay, guys, I just wanted to go over a couple of points on personality theory. And since last semester we went through the humanistic perspective and we also did classical conditioning, I thought I would just touch on biological perspectives a bit because there are some elements of it that we did not do last semester. All right, so when we look at biology, we are speaking about the age old debate of nature versus nurture, which I will get to a little later. But ideally, when we say biology, we mean genetics. Are we genetically predisposed to something? For instance, do we have a family member that might have heart disease? And does this mean that we might have a higher chance of having heart disease? And most often it does, because we can be genetically predisposed to many different characteristics. All right. In the same vein, since we speak about personality theory, we can have our personality traits being passed down from our parents and from our grandparents and our great grandparents to us. Okay, and this is very evolutionary in nature, and our personality comes from an environment that tends to favor certain traits over a period of time. So for those of us that did life science or biology at school, you would remember that Charles Darwin said that only the fittest survive. And in the same way, evolution means that species evolve over time, and as they're evolving, they are passing on their strongest traits to their young or their kin. All right, so evolution itself is a trait that, or a process whereby our traits are born. So to add to that, all right, a lot of the time when we speak about traits passing from person to person, we use something called twin studies. All right. So twin studies are done because there are many genetic similarities between twins. So for instance, if you are looking at identical twins, they have the same DNA and they would have some heritability, right? Meaning that they could have possible genetic closeness, social closeness, and many other traits. So things like how they look, how they speak, all of these traits can be passed down because they are genetically so similar. It also happens whereby we have siblings that share similar traits. Right. Now, the age-old question is, yes, we have a pair of identical twins. Yes, they share the same DNA. They might have the same traits. They might have the same hair color. But does that necessarily mean that they will both have the same type of personality? And the long and short of that is probably not. Despite the fact that they are genetically identical and share many similar traits, a lot of the time they can be very different personality-wise. Okay, in all of the twin studies that I've read, there have been a variety of personality differences or variances between identical twins, despite the fact that they are genetically the same. Okay, that comes down to the nature versus nurture debate, which I'm going to get to in a few slides. All right, so let's talk about a case study, and I'll also tell you about another one, but this is the Jim twins. So the Jim twins are a real life example whereby traits can be passed via genes. So in this case, Jim Lewis and Jim Springer were born identical twins, but they were adopted. So they were adopted by two different families. They finally connected at the age of 39. And it was really funny because they had such similar lives, despite the fact that they lived with completely different families in different states. Okay, so both were the same height and weight, and they had similar habits. What's weirder is that both twins had been married twice to women with the same first names. So their first wife's name was Linda and the second's was Betty. They also drove the same car and the same color of car. So not everything about them, however, was similar. They wore different hairstyles, they chose different professions, but the story of the Jim twins and other studies show that genes may be very closely correlated with our personality traits and our decisions. So there was another similar study to this. It was a set of triplets, and they were identical. And they too were unfortunately given up for adoption at birth. So funny enough, the one was given to a wealthy family, the one was given to a middle class family, and the other one was given to a low income family. And years later, it was two of the triplets that actually found each other first. And they were put in a newspaper article when they found each other. And then a couple of months later, somebody had shown the third triplet this newspaper article. And he was like, hey, I also look like them. And eventually all three of the triplets connected. And similar to the Jim twins, they, in that case, had very similar hairstyles. Yes, they had different professions, but, they were dressed the same, and their wives looked similar, and the cars that they drove looked similar. And some of their personality traits were quite similar, despite the fact that they had lived apart from each other for more than 30 years. When they reconnected, it was almost like looking at two sides of the same coin, in this case, three sides of the same coin. So yes, I mean, many twin studies and adoption studies that have been done, that despite the fact they are living in different environments and away from each other for so many years, they are genetically predisposed to have similar personality traits. All right, hopefully that makes sense. All right, now we move on to neuroplasticity. All right, so neuroplasticity is a term that we use to describe the ability of the brain to change and or be adaptable. All right, so it's very easy for us to say that nature means we cannot change something. Okay, nature meaning our genetics. Our genetics mean that we cannot change something. So if you're born with an aggressive temperament, you can't do much to change your genes. Now, some scientists can agree with this and are massive proponents for the nature theory. But neuroplasticity says that, hey, despite the fact that these are our genes and this is how we've been born, we could possibly adapt and change differently, especially when we are younger. And it is all about how strong those connections or neural pathways are within our brains that can possibly change over periods of time, because we as human beings are not static. We're not standing still. We are ever changing. We are dynamic. So that is more of the nurture perspective, whereby who we surround ourselves with and how we surround ourselves with these people is what could possibly change us and our traits and how we behave and our personality. So our brains do have a lot of potential to change. And I have another story to tell you. I will show you the picture on the next slide, but I'll just give you a bit of a background first. I might have told you the story last semester, but I'll just repeat it for those of you that could have forgotten. It is about somebody named Phineas Gage, and he was a railroad worker. So it was in the 1800s. Bear in mind that medical advancement then is not what it is now, In the 1840s, sure, we had hospitals, we had a couple of doctors, we had people experimenting with surgery, but it is not anything close to what we have nowadays. But in any case, Phineas Gage goes to work, works in the railroad, and one day a rod just was on the tracks, and unfortunately there was an explosion that was near him, and he had been standing on the track where the rod was, and the rod was actually expelled into his eye. So it was an iron rod, and it went straight through his eye. And of course, you would think, my goodness, if an iron rod went straight through my eye, I'd probably be dead. And people thought, you know what, that Phineas was done for. They had no idea that he would actually survive this. But he actually did. He survived it, although a large portion of his frontal lobe and some of his temporal lobe had been damaged. So, funny enough, he actually survived the accident, and he came back to work a couple of months after the accident. But one thing that people at work spoke about was that Phineas Gage now had a very different type of personality. So let me just show you the picture. You can see that the picture of his skull is showing you exactly where the iron rod entered through his head and how it would have damaged his temporal lobe as well as a portion of his frontal lobe. And you can see that Phineas Gage here would have lost a portion of his brain. And when he came back to work, the workers said, hey, Phineas was just not the same person anymore. He was rude, he was loud, he used profane language, he was aggressive. But the Phineas prior to the accident was completely different. He was calm and collected, nowhere close. So he had a complete personality change because his brain had changed. He'd unfortunately lost a portion of his brain, but his brain had changed. And unfortunately, after his accident, Phineas Gage was never the same again. All right. So, studying personality isn't about whether someone is naturally funny or open to new experiences. Answers must also be gathered regarding personality disorders, which we do look at in Learning Unit 4 and 5, and then treatments in 6, which I will go over. So there are some abnormalities that could happen in the brain whereby a personality disorder could occur within a person. But I will touch on that in the next learning units. All right, and then we are going to explore Hans Eysenck. All right, so Eysenck was the first person to speak about the whole nature versus nurture debate. So he said that, hey, we aren't just born with our genetics, and our genetics aren't the only thing that are going to dictate who we are and how we live. We also have our environment that we grow up in, right? So he said that there are many traits that we have as human beings, but they could come from both our parents and our genetics, and they could come from our experiences. And that is what makes us a whole personality, if that makes sense. All right. So we have been speaking about the nature versus nurture debate since last semester. I don't believe that there's ever a right answer to whether nature or nurture influences our personality. We will never know. I do believe it is a combination of both, and that we can never say that one is favored over the other. Okay. Nature and nurture are like ingredients of a cake. Cakes need flour, eggs, baking soda, and a few other ingredients to become a cake. But do we say that flour causes a cake? Not really. We need flour, we need eggs, we need baking powder, we need baking soda. And only after making many cakes can we see the nuances of what adding more or less of each ingredient does to the cake. Flour doesn't cause a cake. genes don't cause personality. However, each part is an important section of the whole. All right. Thank you.